I work at the University of Helsinki, and we have a small environmental humanities hub here. We are trying to build it up, and we just started to organize an environmental humanities month in November 2021. So it's very exciting. Today's speaker in this semester, or with this cohort of CAS fellows, the first speaker is Josef Djordjevski, and his talk is "The Coast is Clean, Managing Water on the Eastern Adriatic Coastline of Yugoslavia and Croatia between 1972 and 2003. And besides, Josef is a dear friend of mine. He is a PhD candidate in history at the University of California, San Diego. His dissertation, advised by Patrick Patterson, is an environmental history of the development of tourism on the Adriatic coast, and is based on research he compiled during 2017 and 2018, funded by the University of California. And I invite kindly Josef to take the floor, and we can collect questions and comments after Josef's presentation is finished.
Thank you for the introduction, Victor. I will share my screen now. I do have a presentation in the form of a PowerPoint. Is the PowerPoint visible?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. So, yeah, thank you, Center for Advanced Studies, for hosting this, and thank you, Victor, for really involving me in this. And for those of you that are going to be in Tres this summer, I'm jealous, first of all, but I think this talk is relevant to that aspect. So I'll get right into my presentation. So I want to start with this idea that I'm sure most of you are familiar with, and that is that the Eastern Adriatic coastline from Slovenia down to Montenegro has a reputation and seeks to portray itself in a certain way, and that is as a green sort of alternative to Mediterranean tourism. And this is something that you can see in the official taglines of certain post-Yugoslav countries on the Eastern Adriatic. From Montenegro, whose official tourism tagline is "Wild Beauty." And then here you can see for Slovenia, "Green and Safe." Croatia's former tagline was "The Mediterranean as it once was." That has, of course, changed to "Full of Life," but still many of the ideas are being presented by the tourism board. And you can see this image here at the bottom: "How deep is your love of nature?" And then this one from the Instagram page of Croatia Full of Life, which presents the coast in this way: "If you're a nature or an animal lover, love to get out of the city, or like to know where your food comes from, there is a place in Europe where you can still lose yourself in truly virgin and diverse landscapes." So this is a sort of representation of the coast that has been in place for quite a long time and has continued to be used to market tourism in the area and also attract visitors. And just a little bit of background, as Victor mentioned, my dissertation is an environmental history of the development of tourism on the Adriatic coast from 1945 up to the present. And what I'm going to be presenting on today is sort of a intervention based on an intervention I make in my dissertation. And I really got inspired and interested in this topic from hearing stories from my father, who was born in Yugoslavia and had memories of traveling to the coast as a kid. And he would tell me these stories about how it was this beautiful, pristine place, this hidden gem. And I always dreamed about going. And then the first time I went to the coast in 2009, after having been exposed to these types of representations, I realized, it wasn't quite such a clear-cut a picture, not to say that it's a tourist trap by any means. There are, of course, very beautiful areas of the coast, and especially when compared to other Mediterranean destinations. However, the Eastern Adriatic coast is not untouched. It's not pristine and it's not wild. There's industry, there's urbanization, and people live there. And as you can see in these images, aside from the Slovenian one, there's no people in them. And I started digging into this a little bit more, and I found that this type of presentation of the Eastern Adriatic is nothing new. As far back as the 19th century, Europe's elite were attracted to the Eastern Adriatic coastline for its perceived healing abilities, especially for what was known as thalassotherapy, or using seawater to cure diseases, especially respiratory ones like bronchitis. And in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, this image was advanced further to kind of present it as this sort of periphery to the more developed parts of Europe, as you can see in this brochure here, which seems to convey a local boy with a woman in Western European style clothing. And I was able to find many tourist brochures at the university, at the National and University Library in Zagreb that has a collection. And you see these types of presentations of wilderness and beauty and natural pristineness throughout the Yugoslav period, both the kingdom and what comes later, which I'll get into. But I just wanted to point out a few of these earlier ones. So here on the left, this is a brochure for the Hotel Palace in Hvar. And at the bottom, it tells its readers in English what's included with a stay at the Palace Hotel. And that is, in the second paragraph here, a weekly excursion to Biševo with the Blue Grotto, but also the beauty of nature sealed with history and art of former centuries, along with the bathing pool of white marble. And those are what awaits you in Hvar. And then this one, also from the Kingdom of Yugoslavia period, it features an image with, again, no people in it, has a cactus, what appears to be aloe vera, and a palm tree. None of those, I think, are even native to the Eastern Adriatic shore, but you can see this kind of untouched picture being sold. But this hasn't stopped there. As recently as 1989, so the last decade of the Yugoslav Federation's existence, we see presentations like this, and this is taken out of a brochure on the Adriatic coast that claims that the Yugoslav Adriatic is still a clean sea, and the natural and cultural heritage on its shores is protected by law. Indeed, the preservation of these values is the responsible task of our age. So my PowerPoint stopped doing what I wanted to. Okay, there we go. And of course, this has resulted in a very successful tourism marketing campaign in the Eastern Adriatic, and especially Croatia. So as you can see in this graph here, Yugoslavia is at the bottom. And between 1960 and 1971, Yugoslavia experienced a 500% increase in the number of visitors to Yugoslavia, the majority of which were on the coastline. And what that did, it was effectively put Yugoslavia fourth among the most visited Mediterranean destinations, just behind Italy, France, and Spain. And so this was quite a dramatic event, and it increased further in the 1980s, especially around 1986, when tourism peaked with the number of overnights on the coast, especially foreign overnights. And of course, you can imagine this leads to a sort of dilemma. So by presenting the coast as this untouched place to attract people to, well, touch it, that presents a sort of contradiction. And I'm citing Anthony Travis here, who argues that tourism relies on heritage resources, both of the natural and built varieties, which it must constantly utilize on a managed basis, neither damaging nor destroying the resource base. So when you look at the presentation of the Adriatic as this sort of pristine wilderness environment to attract more and more people, you can see that there's a very delicate balance there. And that's sort of the focus of my talk. And so how did we get here? The questions I want to address in this presentation are how Adriatic tourism rose to such great numbers while places like Croatia were able to maintain their image as a pristine, untouched, and clean site of natural and built environmental treasures. And some of my answers are that the idea that the sea and the coast was clean, which is reflected in the title of my talk, this was both scientifically and culturally constituted. So it wasn't just successful tourism marketing, it was also backed by scientific currents. It was also both locally and internationally constructed. So Yugoslavs and Croatians themselves sought to advance this idea of a clean coastline, and international organizations played their part as well. Another thing I want to discuss is what the consequences of this, of the development of this idea were. And one of the most striking consequences is conflict between different stakeholders. So with such a delicate natural resource as the coast being sold as this, really wild, untouched place with an alternative to other destinations, conflict would arise between people with stakes in the development of that area. It also led to an over-reliance of tourism, which I'm sure many of you know is a huge part of coastal economies in Montenegro and Croatia, especially today. This idea of the sea being clean also led to really impressive, in my opinion, environmental protection measures, mostly through the establishment of national and nature parks. But it also led to sort of overconfidence that was coupled with ignoring environmental problems, basically with this idea that tourism would come first and infrastructure needed to keep up with mass tourism coming later or second. Now, in order to proceed, I think it's really important to acknowledge the conceptual angle when looking at seascapes, looking at water, along with the land that is adjacent to it. And I approach this topic by looking at the Eastern Adriatic as a hybrid coastline. So basically, it's a coastline that is materially constructed by matter, by the built environment, but also one that's been conceptually and culturally created. And I include a few statements by other scholars that kind of highlights this. So according to Jerry Bentley, it's important that the role of oceans and seas are acknowledged not only as highways of movement, but also as spaces of imaginative projection. Additionally, Tom Selwyn and Jerry Boissevain argue that on one hand, there's the physical realm, which includes the natural built objects associated with it. But on the other hand, there's the realm of the imagined, ideological, and interpretive. And so basically what I want to do in this talk is show how these two different aspects of the coast worked together to kind of create this, this imaginary of a clean sea. And so I use John Ury, the author of The Tourist Gaze's breakdown of environmental conservation that different governments use, especially regarding tourism. And he breaks it down into three different categories. The first one is aesthetic conservation, which seeks to conserve a given environment based on preconceived notions of beauty, followed by scientific conservations, which seek to conserve an environment based on scientific thinking, followed by cultural conservation, which seeks to conserve a particular pattern of life of those living in a given area and to prevent outside interventions. And what I think this presentation will show is that for Yugoslavs and later post-socialist Croatia, aesthetic conservation, or the conservation of these places based on preconceived notions of beauty, are what really predominated. However, they were also backed by scientific conservation. So in order to really understand how this all came about, the best example of examining how culture and science really combined to create an imagined space that was also materially real is through what was known as the Adriatic III project, or Jadran III. And the official title of this was the Project for the Protection of the Human Environment in the Adriatic region of Yugoslavia, which occurred between 1972 and 1978. And this was basically a UN-sponsored project to sort of embed sustainable development into the modernization of the coastline. And it coincided and was a direct reaction of the Stockholm Declaration. The Stockholm Declaration, of course, set the foundations for the United Nations Environmental Program, and it stipulated that healthy environments and sustainable development were a human right. And the architects of Jadran III really took this seriously and attempted to apply that to their own development of the coastline. But Jadran III was also an update of the earlier Adriatic projects, which occurred in the previous decade. And these were also UN sponsored, specifically sponsored by the UN Development Project. And these Adriatic projects that were separated between the Southern Adriatic and the Upper Adriatic sought to develop the coastline of Yugoslavia and bring it up to a higher living standard. And the way that they agreed on achieving this was through the development of tourism. And these projects focused on zoning, so separating certain aspects or certain areas of the coast for different aspects of development, so that tourism and industry, for example, wouldn't interfere with one another. And so again, Jadran III was seen as an update of this earlier project, and was meant to embed sustainability into development, especially of tourism, since as we've seen, it presents a delicate balance. And so the Jadran III project was mainly characterized by studies and monitoring, especially through the Ruđer Bošković Institute in Rovinj and the Institute of Oceanography and Fisheries in Split. And basically the goal was to examine the state of the Adriatic coast and then therefore determine possibilities for further development in a sustainable way. And what they came up with was essentially what is important for this talk. And here I'm citing Josip Žižek, who was a leader of Jadran III and also a proponent of environmental protection in the Socialist Republic of Croatia. And upon the completion of the project, he argued that based on the research of Jadran III, it can be concluded in general that the Adriatic Sea is very clean, especially along the Yugoslav coast, except in some ports, closed bays, and smaller parts of the northern area. And so basically the overall verdict from the studies conducted during Jadran III were that the sea is clean. And so they sort of concluded, based on expert opinions and studies, that the sea was clean and in a better environmental state than other Mediterranean destinations, especially places like Mallorca in Spain or Capri in Italy. But what did that mean for the future of the coast then? It meant that the coast was a competitive market for tourism and that it could be developed due to this state of cleanliness. However, since it was still clean, it needed to be both protected and exploited. So it was clean and untouched, which meant that it was in a perfect position for further development. However, it needed to be developed in a careful way. And then so they agreed that tourism rather than industry was the best way to both exploit and protect the cleanliness of the coastal environment. Tourism was seen as a more sustainable alternative to development. And Franjo Gašparović, the overall director of Jadran III, was a real proponent of tourism, and he argued that it has been found out that tourism, if meaningfully developed, could become and should be activated to become a very powerful ally in the environmental pollution abatement, since it uses the environment as a space and space as basic resources being indirectly included into the tourist services sale price. So here he's basically arguing that since the resource base of tourism is the environment, then naturally tourism should be friendly towards the environment. And this official idea that the Adriatic coast was clean was really reflected in tourism marketing at the time. So here, a tourist brochure from the 1980s for Sunčana Uvala in Hvar characterized it as this: as far as beauty is concerned, Sunčana Uvala is a unique gift of nature with a translucent sea. Here for the island Krk, we see a similar characterization in the 1970s. They say that the marvelous combination of seashore, warm sandy beaches, crystal clear water, and quiet values coupled with cultural and historical interests and rich Slavic folklore, yet affording all modern comforts for the visitor, make this an ideal vacation island. Here's another tourist brochure from the 70s. I'm not going to quote this one. I just love it because it's an advertisement for a hotel, but it doesn't even show the hotel. It just shows this this nice quaint cove with people on a boat. But this didn't just occur at the time of Jadran III. It also is something that is carried on which is evidenced by this piece from a travel guide to Croatia in the late 90s. So, even after the collapse of the Yugoslav Federation. And in this snippet, it says that along with natural diversity and beauties, the stronghold of the optimistic attitude in Croatian tourism lies right in the fact that this territory is ecologically unspoiled. Croatia is one of the least polluted tourist countries of the Mediterranean, the country in which construction has been implemented in compliance with physical and urban development plans, thus avoiding the ecological stress of industrial and urban growth. So you can see this kind of continuation of representation of the coastline. But again, this isn't just something that tourist marketing came up with on its own. It also had official backing. And one of the ways in which these characterizations were officially supported was through international reviews, especially from the United Nations Environmental Program and the Mediterranean Action Plan, who would produce these sort of environmental reviews looking at the state of the environment in its member countries. And the OECD, for example, claimed in 1986 that seawater along most of the Adriatic coast in Yugoslavia is still extremely clean and clear. Wilderness exists in several places. Large numbers of historic buildings still stand in their original settings, surrounded by untouched landscape. Here's a newspaper article claiming that the Adriatic is a clean sea in response to, sorry, that's a magazine article, not a newspaper article. But this was in response to what was concluded in Jadran III. And also in the 1980s, in 1982, 2 years after the death of Tito, there was an update for Jadran III. And for those of you familiar with the historical trajectory of Yugoslavia, you'll know that the 1980s were a period of extreme economic insecurity and uncertainty, and the beginning of ethnic tensions. And so in 1982, amidst these crises, a new Inter-Republican Commission for the Protection of the Adriatic was formed, and they were tasked with reflecting on Jadran III and seeing how it could be applied to the 1980s and moving forward. And what they concluded was basically that things were the same. So they said that regarding the quality of the sea, it has been determined that the Adriatic is for the most part unpolluted, in other words, clean. And so some of the consequences of this idea of the sea being clean, both in the imagined marketing sense and also in the expert scientific sense, were an overconfidence in the ability to manage coastal waters. So since the sea was clean, the sort of immediacy of protecting it wasn't the biggest agenda. Instead, they were confident that tourism was a clean alternative to development, and that environmental balance could be achieved through tourism. But again, this led to conflict over how to keep the sea clean and who was responsible for keeping the sea clean. Different interest groups and stakeholders had their own ideas about that. This also led to an over-reliance of tourism, as many parts of the coast, starting in the 1980s especially, became completely dependent on seasonal mass tourism. And I would like to turn to some case studies in Croatia specifically, not only because Croatia is the largest Adriatic former Yugoslav republic, but also I would argue Croatia continues and has continued to use many of the ideas from Jadran III more than, for example, Montenegro and Slovenia, who have taken their different routes. But before I get into these, how am I on time?
We started a little bit later, so I think you have 10 minutes or even more if you wish, I guess.
Okay, thank you. So I'll turn to a couple case studies in Croatia on the consequences of the idea of the clean sea. And the first one is direct conflict between tourism and industry. So the case study here, I'll be looking at Omiš, which I misspelled. But Omiš is important because this was the site of a particularly intense conflict between proponents of tourism and proponents of industrial development in the 60s and 70s. And Omiš was unique in a couple ways. I included a picture here, and you can see it had a unique environment, especially with the Cetina River going directly into the Adriatic, which presented the people there with sort of two different options for developing tourism. On the one hand, you have the coastal resort tourism, and on the other hand, you have river hiking, canyon sort of nature tourism potentials on the other hand. And Omiš also had a unique history. In the early modern period, Omiš served for a time as an independent peasant republic and was also famous for its pirates. And during the period under discussion, there were groups that wanted to really preserve both the environmental and historical heritage of this area. And most of the population in Omiš by the 1960s, according to official reports, was employed in tourism either through the state-owned hotels and workers' organizations or by renting out private accommodations to guests. Also during the Adriatic projects, Omiš was specifically mentioned as a place where tourism should be the main economic sphere for the local economy. However, Omiš also had a history of industry, as you can see in this newspaper article. Omiš, being kind of represented by both its history and environment, and also industrial development. So since the 19th century, there were two particular factories along the coastal belt that many locals saw as threatening the development of tourism, and those were the Renko-Šperac cement factory in Ravnice and the Dalmatia carbide factory in Dugi Rat. So both of these had been around since the 19th century. They switched hands from the Austro-Hungarians to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, now to socialist Yugoslavia. And a large part of the population was also employed in these industries. So on the one hand, they might be employed in one of the factories, while on the other hand, renting out rooms to tourists. So there was this real contradictory attention going on here. And due to the sort of conclusion of Jadran III that the sea was clean and that tourism was a cleaner alternative, it gave those proponents of tourism the upper hand in the conflict here. And in the late 1970s, this erupted into lots of arguments and squabbling between the different groups. And finally, a large group of citizens in 1979 declared a referendum against these so-called dirty industries that threatened the clean environment of Omiš. And they won, and the Renko-Šperac cement factory, for example, that was planning on updating into a sintered magnesite plant was eventually taken down and replaced for tourism purposes. However, you can imagine with the success of tourism come pressures. And so a particular case study is that of Stari Grad in Hvar, or the Bay of Stari Grad. And successful tourism here led to pressures on an outdated sewage system, which throughout the 70s and 1980s was continuing to dump untreated sewage directly into the bay. And this led to, I'm sure you can imagine, foul smells and complaints among tourists and locals alike about the sewage system. And so the municipality of Hvar sends a letter to the Institute of Oceanography and Fisheries in Split in 1976, asking them to undertake a study on the state of the bay. And IZOR, the institute, determined that the bay was so polluted that it was inadvisable to consume shellfish from the bay, and that if the sewage wasn't treated, that it could be disastrous. And so the local community struggled to upgrade its sewage system, but as I mentioned, in the 1980s, this was a time of economic downturn, and finding the money to do that was difficult. And it's ironic that in 1986, when this problem really became clear, there was also the height of tourism in Yugoslavia. And so Hvar requested the Parliament of Socialist Republic of Croatia for funds to update the sewage system, citing the study by the Institute of Oceanography and Fisheries. And in a letter to the Croatian Parliament, they said that our bay is and I quote them here, a large septic tank that if wasn't updated would be disastrous for the local tourism economy. However, due to a lack of funds, the Croatian Parliament responded that they wouldn't be able to produce the funds to update the sewage system, and the local community would be responsible for coming up with the funds themselves, which they were unable to do. And as far as I've been able to kind of track this story up until 1997, at least, raw sewage was still being pumped directly into Stari Grad Bay. Finally, the last case study, something really related to sewage, is the case of red tides and algal blooms. So algae blooms are explosions of phytoplankton that can really take over all the oxygen in a given marine area, killing several of the organisms and leading to foul smells and also discoloration of the water. So much of the Adriatic, Eastern Adriatic, has marketed this crystal clear blue water, but algae blooms tend to change the water to either green, dark brown, or red even. And there had been cases of algae blooms and red tides on the coast before, as far back as the 19th century, but mostly along the Po River Delta on the Italian coast, where runoff from the city of Milan would be, going directly into the Adriatic Sea. But in the 1970s and 80s, these became more frequent as tourist numbers rose, and especially alarming for Croatia and Yugoslavia was that they started occurring on their coast, especially in Istria or Istra and Kaštela Bay near Split. So there were two really particularly severe cases of red tide in 1973 and 1983. And I'm sure you can imagine this led to hysteria. This hysteria was mostly predicated on the fact that this was a huge threat to tourism and especially the marketing of the coast as being clean. And this was reflected in several of the newspapers. This one, the headline that "The Sea Blooms, Guests Leave" from 1988. This is one of my favorites. It's a fish wearing a gas mask. And it says, it's not bad, it'll be worse, also from the 1980s. And there were several other cases of this. One newspaper went so far as calling it the Adriatic Chernobyl. And so in response to this, the cases were so severe that even the federal government in Belgrade got involved and funded and came up with the funds to introduce protective measures against the algae blooms. However, since most of the causes of the algae blooms were from cases like in Hvar, where untreated sewer was increasing the nutrient counts, the protective measures that were funded were temporary ones, including blocking off swimming areas and beaches with nets so that the red tide wouldn't come near the coast, and also funding the use of special boats to kind of sail around scooping up the algae with nets. And none of the funds were used to update the sewage systems. So to conclude, the idea of the clean Adriatic led to some problems, and I specifically focused on those, but it also led to some impressive measures at protection, especially with national and natural parks being established. Probably the most important of which was the Kornati archipelago off the coast of Zadar and Šibenik, where it became official in 1980 as a natural reserve. However, Croatia especially has continued to engage with policies directly inspired by Jadran III. In fact, in 1992, when the new Ministry of Environmental Protection came about, they specifically cited Jadran III as kind of determining the framework for which they would approach the coast. And with this myth of the sea being clean, true to an extent, but also, allowing the potential for severe problems that need to be addressed, I want to leave with the question of how much being clean can the Adriatic Sea really handle? And I think maybe it's time for Croatia, instead of asking tourists how deep is their love of nature, to ask themselves the same question. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. This was a very, very inspiring talk. I noted dozens of questions on my little notebook, but I think many of us feel the same way. So I think it's time to open up for questions and comments. And it's a small group, so maybe we do not have to indicate that we would want to ask a question or make a comment. We just go ahead if you want.
Should I stop sharing my screen or?
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Can you hear me?
Yes, Gabriel.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Thank you for your talk and also for beautiful images, and was a very interesting lesson. It reminded me the stories of my parents that they were young and they went on holiday to Yugoslavia and also listened strange but very nice socialist songs. And it was a beautiful holidays for them. And I would like to ask a question that maybe could be interesting for your research about the tourism against industry. Because a few years ago, there was a referendum in Italy in order to authorize the extraction of oil in the Adriatic Sea. Obviously, there was a big debate, and Romano Prodi is a former Italian Prime Minister and also a former President of the European Commission. He said that Croatia was very aggressive in extracting oil, and that since the Adriatic Sea is both Italian and Croatian, it was fair that also Italy did extraction. Later, the Italians rejected this project, but I would like to ask you if Romano Prodi was right or if Romano Prodi said a fake news, and what is the situation now about tourism and also oil industry?
Yes, thank you so much. Should I respond to the question or should we take questions? Okay, so this is actually a very big part of the story, something that I do try to touch on in my dissertation, but tensions between oil extracting specifically and tourism have been something that was always a part of the story, especially in the Kvarner area, for example, on the island of Krk in Omišalj, where oil refining is occurring to the chagrin of those who want to develop in tourism. So I don't think that the Prime Minister was completely selling fake news, but I do think it is a bit more complicated because, you know, from what I can tell in the sources that I've looked at, every time Yugoslavia or Croatia tried to really further develop the oil industry, it met with lots and lots of opposition. And I think that this opposition, which is local opposition, has slowed down this process of oil development. However, now that we're in a post-socialist or post-socialist era, I don't think it is any longer just a story of, for example, Croatia and oil drilling. Now it's, for example, the state-owned, formerly state-owned oil company INA is also co-owned by the Hungarian MOL company. So there's lots of different parties involved in oil drilling and development these days. And I think that Croatia still has a huge opposition campaign against further drilling of oil. So it's very complicated, and I wouldn't characterize it as Croatia being aggressively involved in oil extraction, but maybe certain groups from Croatia, but there's also an equally large opposition in Croatia to oil extraction.
Thank you. Maybe we can conclude that it's Mr. Orban who is behind all these pollution problems. This is, of course, just a joke. Okay.
No, Victor, it's not a joke. It's not a joke. we have that. I'm sorry for interrupting, but then it's really important. It's not a joke because it's the Visegrad group. It's all those tendencies to make Europe more conservative. And those pressures and lobbying is not only on economical level. Of course, we are like, we know what we are facing. So behind, it's a butterfly effect. You have it in industry, you have it in economy, you have it on the level of the European Union and standards. And this is that actually Croatian people do not see. We have some struggles. Let's say now the local elections are approaching. What is it that we're having in our programs? Are we really facing this issue of environment steadily and with argument, or this is something that is already served, already prepared on the plate? So the thing with what Victor is doing and his proposal on waste, and then what you now offered us as a knowledge and perception, is very, very interesting and valuable for what we're doing. I will give you an example. Last week, which is the last weekend, I spent on Cres, on the island, together with 12 of my students from visual communication and graphic design, and Lucia was with us also, because we were invited by the local community, the guy who is very active in local community, and that's one of the main goals of the Center for Advanced Studies, to work on biding with the local community. And that's how we imagine our stay at Cres in the palace. And we worked on the project An Island Without Plastic. And it was very useful. The Ugo Tojic, the guy who is the activist, and he's actually in the official local government. So that's the self-aware people that work on this point of no plastic at the island. The thing is very complex, and this is what Joseph, you proposed. On one side, you need to survive. You need to survive. You need to go on with your economy. You need to advance your local politics, etc., etc. And on the other, you have the world. And when I say the world, we also watched together Seaspiracy. So we saw piracy. So we saw the documentary and we discussed it, and it's a global problem. It's not something that you can have like a unique answer to it. It's always a double-blind situation, and we discussed about the fishery industry, about all that is happening if there is any industry on the island. And this preservation or intention to make a pristine nature, it's like it's a fiction. How we put things together, and how do we how we as academic, we are supposed to be academic tourists. So we are going there and we work there, and Kevin and Tanya and Milos and Rosvita, we know, and you are going to experience it as well. What is it that we are proposing to the local community? And what is it that we are getting back? So tell me, sharpen what I want to hear from you is like, I know you're an academic, you need to have all things clear, but come on, let's be more into a avant-garde thinking. What would be your proposal on anthropological proposal on resolving this this friction between keeping the nature, which is preserving the nature, and then still going on, still advancing, not the economy, but the life on the island, because people, young people, they left to the countryside. You have a lot of elderly. Who is going to take care of them? How they're going to survive? You see the tension between two, going on with the life, and then keeping it with a human face, or is it the human face? Which kind of approach can you give us with your knowledge, because you have it?
Thank you, Tanya. Sanya, this is very, very important. I think really to the core of the problem. And Josef, now the solution is in your hands. You have to give us a definite answer and solve all the problems of capitalism and communism in one sentence.
I'm a historian. I recuse myself of this. No, it's really important, and you know, the sort of takeaway that I've gotten from my research is that attempts to preserve the environment, built or natural, is an outdated concept. You can no longer preserve a local environment, especially with climate change and global problems like Sanya brought up. There's no longer the same question. Now it's a global problem, and I guess rather than focusing on trying to preserve things, especially to attract tourists, the question should be how to move forward in a way that ensures that you'll be able to keep living where you're living into the future. So, you know, tourists like to visit the Adriatic, especially because of old architecture and these types of environments, but trying to preserve those ignores so many other factors that actually affect those directly. And so I think what I would maybe suggest, and of course I'm not an expert on contemporary policy making, but I would suggest to think more globally than locally in this context.
Excuse me, can I say something? Yeah, I would like to say that to Sanya, I think you are right, but I think that the main important effect in this situation is not butterfly effect, but the most important is tragedy of commons effect, because we have a lot of actors that act independently, and making their own interesting, destroy oil, extract oil, and destroy the sea, and also tourism and so on. So I think that, yeah, the most important, there is also a butterfly effect, but the most important is tragedy of commons, and we need coordination also in the European Union to make to have good policies in this sector, I think.
Thank you for both of your comments and questions, and maybe we can take some more.
May I?
Absolutely.
Or Victoria, I'm sure you have many questions that you wrote down, and we're all just taking your time. So I've noticed that there's this big sort of controversy happening with energy in the Balkans, and specifically these hydroelectric plants that are being built across the different countries here. And similarly, the argument for ecological protection has been, no, we need to stop these plants, which I agree with, but so that we can attract foreign tourists to our forests. And there's something that to me just strikes me, and I think this is where you really hit me hard with this. I was like, oh, I see this happening as a pattern. It strikes me as wrong in that it can sort of have these other effects, but in terms of these, maybe it's environmental ethics, or I'm not sure what, but is there an alternative, because we are so caught between these economies of like, is it industry or is it tourism, or why do we conserve nature? Is there a sort of alternative way of thinking beyond this that might be, you know, conservation for its own sake or for something else, which what might not just be climate change in this broader commons, but for a more localized thing, if that is a question in itself. I'm sorry, Joseph.
Joseph, another very simple and easy question waiting for you from Thailand.
So this is actually something that I've thought about a lot, because another major, I guess, narrative thread in my dissertation is how environmental protection developed due to the relationship with tourism, always had a kind of economic component, economic justification. And the problem with that, as you mentioned, not just on the coast, but everywhere, is that, you know, if we stop industry, then we'll attract tourists, and that brings a whole new set of problems. So until you really see the rise of alternative NGOs, green movements, and civil societies really challenging this this kind of dichotomy between industry and tourism, so economic on either side, there hasn't really been much in my, from what I've seen, any kind of official policy on that. So I don't know what to suggest with that, but I would say, yes, we do need a paradigm shift for protecting the environment that doesn't attach it to economic progress, because once you do that, then you're still going to threaten that for which you are seeking to protect. And yeah, very complicated stuff.
If I may jump in with a very brief comment, that in Finland, the environmental social sciences dialogue is, it lacks very much the historical layer. It's all about current issues and quick fixes, and with techno optimism, with technology and science, we will tackle all these problems. There is not really the way I have been witnessing it. I do not really see a meaningful dialogue in many disciplines about the need or the urge of getting rich, making money, consuming. I do not really understand these quick fixes as tackling the core of the problem in a way. There will be all these technological solutions, and everybody is going to eat beans instead of meat, and I don't know, drive around in Teslas, and that's going to have an impact, obviously, and it's going to have also a lot of positive and maybe some negative impact. But I don't see many scholars asking the question about the path that we have been taking in the past 200 years as humans, as a society, global society.
And I wonder with that, if it's like the only solution may be this like degrowth model, but it's the one that we are all too afraid to, or that most people are too afraid to say like, okay, well, this is kind of going to be it. Yeah, thank you both.
Thank you.
I think, actually, I have no idea when should we finish. I didn't check that with Marco. So, Sonia, do we still have some time for questions?
11:30, so go on. Yeah.
Okay.
This is the discussion. It's like a
So
recoming.
I'll just jump in then. First of all, thank you so much for the very interesting talk. It hit close to home, specifically because I do live on an industrial port, and people always imagine this beauty view and everything. And from my balcony, I have an obstructed view of the sea, obstructed first by a dilapidated warehouse for exporting lumber, and then the small window of sea that I actually do have looks directly out onto the refinery in Omišalj, which is wonderful. But I'm not complaining. I'm very happy about it. So first of all, the old tourism material was fascinating, and it was really fun to look at for me. I know some of these slogans have worked their way into parodies these days, and I've seen some recent stuff floating around, like the Mediterranean as it once was, come to Dubrovnik and experience the original quarantine. Though to be fair, it was only 3 weeks. It was a Trentine, and it was the Venetians who made it 4 weeks. But to your dissertation, I do have a question. I'm wondering, you know, you've talked about how Yugoslavia addressed these issues with Adriatic III, and how post-socialist Croatia has engaged with some of these same issues. I'm curious about the international element, and specifically this phenomenon of the Foundation for Environmental Education and the Blue Flag beaches, the Blue Flag certification. I know several tourists that I've traveled with, primarily from Germany, who would only go to Blue Flag beaches. There are guides available, and I'm curious because from what I understand, this Blue Flag designation is not only for environmental purity, but also for a certain amount of infrastructure that makes it sustainable, such as having waste disposal on site so people don't litter the beach when they do go there. So have you looked into this at all in your dissertation? And that's all I'm asking. Thanks.
Thank you, Kevin. First of all, I'll answer that, but I want to go back to this thing about Rijeka and how you're describing this kind of post-industrial landscape. I think that's really interesting because, you know, when Rijeka was in the process of preparing for the cultural capital, I was part of this workshop, Liquid Cities, and there was this discussion on, you know, like, what's the future of Rijeka? Is it tourism or is it something else? You know, and it's like, you can see when proponents of tourism in Rijeka kind of like transforming it from a post-industrial place to a tourist one, or making the same exact kind of arguments you've heard a million times before, you know what I mean, that it's more environmentally friendly, that, you know, it's more sustainable. But then when you look at places that already have that, like Split, for example, you see how polluted Kaštela Bay is, you know, so it's, can Rijeka, if they do decide to approach tourism as the way forward, will they do maybe a better job than in the previous cases? But for the Blue Flag designation, I don't know anything about that really. That's probably more recent, I'm assuming, right? I'm not sure when the Blue Flag started.
I think it started in the 80s.
In the 80s, okay.
But I don't know when Croatia actually got on board with it. I know Croatia is involved now, but I think it might be more recent.
Okay.
I just checked, it started in 87.
87, okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting because, you know, in looking at the archives for the Republican Fund for Environmental Protection of Socialist Republic of Croatia, and also the Republički Komitet za Turizam, the Republican Committee for Tourism, I didn't really see any mention of the Blue Flag, so I'm not sure how. I'm assuming if it was around in 87, they were aware of it because.
Sorry, it was in France. I'm sorry, Joseph. It was in France, not in Yugoslavia. So 87, France.
Okay. 87, France. Okay. I'm sure that Yugoslav tourism stakeholders were aware of this, but I haven't really seen anything in the bureaucratic chit chat in the 80s. You know, this might have come up in post-socialist Croatia a bit more, which is a part of my dissertation, but something that's, you know, it's with the recency of it, it's kind of hard to find stuff in the archives, right? So But with that said, a kind of similar to Kevin's question about the overall international aspect, another really important designation aside from the blue flag is UNESCO World Heritage Sites, and Kotor, Dubrovnik, and Diocletian's Palace in Split were all inducted into the UNESCO World Heritage List in 1980, and some of the stipulations were that they were in a state of sustainable development, so that they could kind of stay in the preserved state while attracting tourists. And until recently, I think that they were kind of left to just be overdeveloped. And now there's threats by UNESCO of taking some of them off the list if they don't slow things down. Of course, with the shelling of Dubrovnik in 1991, that was something completely different. But I think that if the blue flag is anything like UNESCO, it almost has zero sort of impact on the trajectory of these sites. The threats, for example, for Ohrid in Macedonia have been continuous since about 2011, that if they keep developing and building stuff, that they'll take Ohrid off the UNESCO list, and nothing's really changed, and they still haven't taken them off the list. So it's this kind of really innocuous sort of thing, and the locales can still present these as UNESCO sites, which carries all kinds of meanings with it, even though they're threatened as such.
Thank you.
I don't know if that answered your question at all, if that was a tangent.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, we still have about 20 minutes, so there is ample amount of time for further questions.
Come on, we want to hear you, Victor. It's your.
Oh, okay, very good. Yeah, thank you, Josef, for this talk. It's very, very interesting. And can I share maybe a little bit of a secret with the others, Josef, about our cooperation? Is that okay with you? Okay,
so you have to do it in Hungarian.
Yeah, I have to do it in Hungarian. We just submitted a Hungarian article text with Josef that is comparing state socialist environmental protection and tourism development efforts in Yugoslavia, in Croatia, and in Hungary, especially around Balaton, Lake Balaton. And we are developing this project further, and I hope to include some more stuff on Danube, and I guess Josef is going to include more stuff on some other cases, and we hope to have an English text as well in a few months. But that's the plan. We will see, because the Hungarian was planned to be finished like half a year ago, and we finalized it last week. Okay, so yeah, about I think I picked this issue about the algae blooms. If you could tell just a little bit more about this to us, because I have a personal interest in algae blooms. I live literally, I see the beach from my window, and this is one of the most polluted seas in the world, the Baltic Sea. And we have regular algae blooms thanks to fertilizers used by good Finnish agribusinesses. And I can use this beach only when it's normally too cold. When it's warm, it's very greenish and brackish. So I just wonder if you could tell a little bit more about the history of algae blooms in Yugoslav Adriatic coast.
Yeah, for sure. So as I'm sure many of you know, the Adriatic Sea is really low in nutrient counts. So unlike the Baltic Sea, the reason why it's clear is because it has low nutrient counts. It's oligotrophic. And the opposite end of the spectrum from oligotrophic is eutrophic. So more nutrients, less oxygen. And the Adriatic Sea is still, for the most part, oligotrophic with low nutrient counts and continues to maintain this clear characteristic. But along the Italian coast, especially around the Emilia-Romagna area with the River Po, there have been algal blooms recorded at least since the 19th century, and also up around Trieste and Istria as well. But in the 1970s, they started becoming more frequent and moving down the coast on the eastern side, which was what was alarming people in Yugoslavia, because they had been aware of algal blooms, but that was an Italian thing, and when it started becoming a Yugoslav problem, the majority of studies blamed it on both currents that were bringing in runoff from the Po River, but also runoff from Yugoslavia itself. So kind of extra pressures of things like fertilizers, industrial runoff, but especially sewage, especially where the majority of sewage systems on the coast in Yugoslavia were not updated and we're not treating the sewage, it was raw sewage. And so since then, the red tides are pretty frequent and almost annual, but the severity is different. There was one in this last summer around Istra. You can find news articles of it, but it was a bit smaller. And the reason why it was such a big deal in the 70s and 80s is because it was new for the most part to be in those places, like especially around Split area. But also some studies have also maybe considered that climate reasons for also contributing to the severity of these. So either way, it's not good. Whether it's like a local thing or if we go back to the global conversation, climate change also affects algal blooms too, not just runoff. So that's something that should be alarming for the entire Mediterranean.
Can I follow up just briefly on that? So I wonder what is causing these algae blooms in the Adriatic coast in the east? Is it the oil refining industry, or is it urban pollution, or these wastewater treatment plants, which are maybe not be perfect? Or is it the agriculture? But I reckon that agriculture on the other side of the mountains, mainstream agriculture activities might be not so present, I guess, on the Adriatic coast.
Well, in Istria, most of the physical makeup of the land is karstic, and there's lots of underground waterways, and so those take the industrial runoff basically kind of underground through the karst into the sea. But to answer your question, Victor, I think it's a combination of all of those things: agricultural runoff, sewage runoff, climate change. Oil extracting, probably not so much. That would be more responsible for like oil slicks and a completely different problem. But it's actually interesting because in the 1980s, when they started hiring these boats to go around and clean up the algae, a lot of them were boats that had also been commissioned to clean up oil from the surface. So they're using the same technology to clean oil and algae from the Kvarner Bay area. So yeah, this is, my marine biology skills are, probably lacking to the extent where they would be needed to answer that question better. But that's from what I can tell, it's a combination of factors.
Thank you. Okay, we still have time, and Sanya is raising her hand.
Just going ahead with what you said, it has been a tendency in all Istrian cities, in Pula, in Rovinj, in Poreč, and then same thing in Cres. You do have those collectors, they asked for European money, structural funds, to invest into the bay area. So now in Cres, in let's say 15 years ago or 10 years ago, you couldn't find periska in Cres Bay, and now you can find them. Same thing in Pula. So the area has been changing. The coastal area has been changing, and of course, algae, you're having them as soon as the temperature goes higher, and now like summers are a degree or 2 degrees even more, the temperature is not 30 degrees, 31, it's 33 in August, in early August. And this is also something that is as a consequence of the appearance of algae. So Europe, and through these structural funds, is investing in cultural or everyday shift in way people live on the coast. And I don't know when was the last time that you've been to Istria, but those cities are changing, Pula especially, and they're trying to make it more preserved. And then you are not having shipyards anymore. The shipyard business kaput, no more. That's also part of the landscape. There is no industry, and as a contrast to this, you have no industry, and people working in the industry now are like trying to develop the tertiary sector, which is the tourism. And you are having Airbnbs, and this is a chaotic process. No rules, nothing. So you have people now, like, you're not having blue flag tourists, but you're having low income Europeans coming to the coast because that's the best way to go to the sea, and on the other side not spend too much. So that's also this disequilibrium of that is happening. How we
Something
are
that
go ahead.
I'm sorry, you can finish if
No, I'm fine, go ahead.
okay. That was just since you brought up the shipbuilding, Treći Maj and all these places, they're like struggling or they're going to be gone soon. And this also ties into the algae. When you replace these shipbuilding areas with ports for cruise ships, that also contributes to algae with ballast water and the pollution that brings, and then just a flood of tourists coming in and using the facilities in the area for a quick time is probably, in my opinion, worse for the environment than industry. And I think a lot of aspects of mass tourism specifically are worse actually for the local environments than industry, which can, to an extent, be controlled locally if proper technology is used. Oil, of course, too many problems to even start, but this replacing industry with tourism is not, in my opinion, from what I've seen, a viable or better solution. In fact, it could be worse.
Especially mass tourism. So consumerism and mass tourism. Maybe we can even bring in a nuance into what the tourism can look alike. We are not fighting here tourism that existed, I don't know, in history, in Rome, in Middle Ages. I mean, it was, people traveled. That's normal thing. But the consumerism and mass tourism, main points of how people travel nowadays. And then they travel for a week or for 2 weeks. And before you are going to travel, and then you go for 6 months and you are away for a longer period of time. And that makes sense. But going like for a weekend just to touch the sea and then go back, no point of it. So a lot of aspects are there and can be measured and thought through. So it's not that we are against traveling or knowing other countries and visiting. It's the quality of it. It's the way how we do it, how we organize it. And again, I'm listening to what I'm saying. The important thing which is not to keep it as a class thing, that only people that are rich can travel. That's the point. At the same time, we need to fight this capitalist, again, consumerist and mass tourist aspect of it. If you have the money, then you can go to preserved areas. You can, maybe Kevin can tell us more about blue flag thing. What does it mean? Is it also blue flag? Okay, I'm like tourist with a refined taste, and I'm not going to Gruž, but I'm going only to the heart of the Dubrovnik and stay there, or on some of the islands. I'm not going to touch those popular tourist spots. But it's also this equilibrium, the individual attitude of a person who is traveling. Either you call it or not a tourist, but a traveler, who is he or she? What's the attitude? How do you prepare to when you start visiting? And yeah,
I think Croatia made a positive move recently. I mean, we'll see, it's too early to tell, but with this idea of giving visas for these digital nomads who come to plan to stay long-term in Croatia, I think that's a much better approach. But we'll see what happens. I'm really excited to see what happens with the coronavirus measure impact on tourism, and I hope it opens up people's eyes that tourism is maybe not the most dependable, especially seasonal tourism, maybe not the most dependable economic pursuit, since it's so dependent on outside factors, external factors.
I just want to jump into that to second that in a Hungarian context, of probably what you have seen in some of the islands in the Croatian coast. People in Budapest have seen it as well. The people come to consume alcohol and disrespect the city, just encompassing what's going on with these 18, 21, whatever year old tourists, sometimes older and behaving very similar. and I wonder, to follow up on both of your lines, that when comes a point when a society or a region or a city or an entire country decides that we can afford not opting for these kind of opportunities that these low-cost airlines and low-cost carriers can present to us, and the kind of tourism that it facilitates, but we want to opt for something different. Like, I don't know, I'm not an expert on tourism in Latin America, but Costa Rica has a great reputation as an environmentally friendly destination with dozens of national parks, and it's a kind of tourism that they have been facilitating for, I think, for decades now. So yeah, I think that's a question for both Hungary and maybe for Croatia as well. I don't know.
And a large part of it, I think, is access. I mean, Ryanair and Wizz Air making it easy to go from London to Budapest to destroy the city for a weekend, as opposed to, getting to Costa Rica might not be as easy. You actually have to kind of dedicate yourself to go there, could be a thing. Same with, these, you can fly to Rijeka or Split for the weekend. And it's complicated because in a way it's a democratic process, right? It's making the masses be able to experience this, but democracy comes with challenges. So we'll see what happens. Who knows if these airlines will even survive after the pandemic. We'll see what happens.
With some government help, I'm sure they will somehow.
Yeah. I mean, for one, I'm planning on going to Croatia. Me and my fiance, who's from Croatia, are planning on getting married. But from Germany to Croatia, which used to be a very easy and cheap flight, is very difficult now. From even Munich or Frankfurt to Zagreb is a very expensive, long, grueling process. So we'll see what happens with travel.
Congratulations.
Welcome to.
Thank you.
You're most welcome to come to join us, and we are looking forward to your thesis defense. Afterwards, do not forget that you have a possibility for postdoc in the area, in the center.
Thank you.
Thank you,
And-
Victor, for bringing us such a perfect start of our seminar for the spring semester.
Thank you. I've been advertising the CAS to Joseph very avidly. Keep sending him links and messages.
Good.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody, very much. And thank you, Joseph, for a great talk, and Victor. And we'll be seeing each other next Thursday at 10 a.m. And this is it for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye
Thanks,
bye.
everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Enjoy
Bye
it.
bye.
Ciao.
Ciao.